to Dr. Tyrone Freeman's talk. My name is David King. I'm the director of the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving. We're housed in the Indiana University Public Family School of Philanthropy. And our mission really is to engage this dynamic intersection of how faith inspires and informs giving. And so we do that around research and scholarship, education and training, and public conversations. And this just is one of those great examples of a public conversation where we really bring leaders together from around the country and throughout our Indianapolis community to dig into some deep, fascinating conversations about how these difficult topics sometimes, like religion and philanthropy, faith and giving, fit together. And so I'm delighted to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Tyrone Freeman, to you all today for the presentation that he is going to help host with us. Dr. Freeman is the Glenn Family Chair in Philanthropy at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, where he serves as Associate Professor of Philanthropic Studies, holding an adjunct appointment as Associate Professor of Common Studies, and is a research associate at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Yes, that's Smithsonian. Serves on the Advisory Council of the Mays Institute on Diverse Philanthropy, our sister institute in the School of Philanthropy, and we're grateful to partner with them in their work. Previously, before being a full-time academic, Tyrone was a professional finder working in youth development, youth and social services in higher ed. He was associate director of the fundraising school, which is a key part of our School of Philanthropy, where we train nonprofit leaders in the United States and almost every other time as well. Proud HBCU grad from Lincoln University. Master's in adult education from IU, urban and regional planning from Ball State, and his PhD in philanthropic studies from Indiana University. In 2022, Dr. Freeman was named and received the Dan David Prize, which is really the world's largest history prize for groundbreaking research in African American philanthropy. In 2023, he was awarded the prestigious Indiana University Presidential Arts and Humanities Fellowship, really in recognition of his contribution and future contribution to the study of philanthropy using history of humanity. Research focused on the history of philanthropy in communities of color, philanthropy in higher education, and his latest book, which we'll have available for purchase just right outside here, where you can talk to Dr. Tyrone Freeman, is Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving Black Women's Philanthropy through Jim Crow from the University of Illinois Press. 2020. Now, it examines African American women's history, charitable giving, activism, education, and social service provision through the life and example of Madam C.J. Walker, who I believe is a member here at right, historically right here, where you're sitting today. Which the book has received, let's say, multiple awards. In 2021, the Association of Fundraising Professionals Global Status Partnered Research Prize in Fundraising and Philanthropy. 2021, Terry McKinley Book Award from the Alliance for Nonprofit Management. And most recently this year, the Peter Dotkin Hall History of Philanthropy Prize from the Association for Research on Nonprofit and Voluntary Action. His work has appeared in places like the New York Times, the Oprah Magazine, Time, Harvard Business Review, Stanford Social Innovation Review, Black Perspectives, Chronicle of Philanthropy, Case, and Advancing Philanthropy. Tyrone is an accomplished scholar and a tremendous speaker, and I've learned so much from this work. But perhaps what I've appreciated most is his passion for teaching, patience with students, and his uncanny ability to communicate and translate not only in the university classroom, but to any audience. There's a group of fundraisers, members of a giving circle, pastors, lay volunteers. Tyrone draws our attention to the big questions of the past, the present, and looking to the future, and can open up for our imagination so we might just take that next step to respond to what we heard, and perhaps see it anew and take part in philanthropy or generosity that's all around us. And I can say that I've been blessed to be a colleague and a friend to Dr. Tyrone Freeman, and I know you'll be blessed by his words today as well. So please help me welcome Dr. Tyrone Freeman and your reflections about his question.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'm very happy to be here with you today. It's always good to be in the house of the Lord. Know the sign outside says, but we know where we really are.
Well,
I want to just let you know how excited I am to be here. Grateful to my friend, my brother, colleague, Dr. David King, for the invitation and opportunity to be here today. To all my colleagues at the Wake Institute, putting on a wonderful event the past 2 days. That has been a blessing. I had a chance to be with the cohort yesterday, and that was fun. Also to our dean, your pastor, to the esteemed bishops, clergy, laity, leaders and friends. Good morning again. I'm excited to be here with you today because of who you are and what you represent to me. Today, when I look out at you, I see scholars in the grand tradition of the Black biblical interpretation. I see professionals and lay leaders who build and direct institutions. But most importantly, as a preacher's kid, I see your family. I see in you the family who raised me, made me who I am. I see in you the family that taught me the ways of Black generosity. Not only by talking the talk, but by walking the walk. And to be frank, that's why I came by and spent time with the cohort yesterday, because I want to be sure I get my family. Because you know, all skin folk ain't what? They grow. But today, the skin folk are skin folk. And beyond that, we are one in spirit, which also adds added meaning to this event. I'm excited that I have two special guests here with me today. My beautiful wife, Michelle Freeman, my wonderful son, Alexander, McKinley Freeman, who's the vice president of the program for my nation. Alexander is a junior at the School of Philanthropy. Great blessings in my life. My daughter Lydia is away at college. Family's everything, amen? And family's important for what I talk about today. When David approached me about this occasion, he said he wanted a presentation that would help us remember and explore the practices and traditions that have formed us as givers. He said we find ourselves in a time where we must redevelop, perhaps even reimagine, generosity in faith communities, and that generosity in Black faith communities deserves more attention than it currently gets. So I was honored to be asked, but I also immediately felt the daunting pressure of the assignment. What could I share that would resonate with you? You who have charge over congregations, districts, conferences, denominations. You who provide lay leadership in all areas of church operation. You who have nurtured the very generosity that is our subject. You have secured the widow's mite, the working and middle class tithe, and the wealthy's windfall. You've taught your flocks not only to not give up God, but to render unto the Lord for all the saints. But when it comes to giving, you know very well that sometimes the flock listens, and sometimes they don't. Huh? The material culture of the simple world can be distracting and tempting. The physical demands and needs of this world can be daunting and crushing. The global economy is volatile, and naturally we do not do a good job of taking care of the least of these. There is suffering in our congregations and communities. So today's Black church finds itself in a very precarious position. And you know this precarity better than I do. You know the ebbs and flows of membership and attendance. You know the trends that cause spikes in attendance during Easter and Christmas, then hollow out your pews during summer recess. And you feel it in your collection plates or online transactions. You know the growing number of atheists and religious nuns, NONES, in the country. Religious identity, membership, and participation is declining among Americans overall. But for a while there, the Black church got to proudly step back and say, we're good. That's not us. That's other folk. Yeah. Right? Black folks' religious identity is holding strong while everybody else is declining. But now we're starting to see younger generations of Black Americans rethinking the faith of their fathers and mothers. Their own institutional suspicion and an ongoing quest to dismantle systems and ideologies that they see as oppressive is affecting Black participation in religious institutions. Some are leaving the church for more racially diverse churches. Some are leaving the church altogether to live a spiritual life with no institutional commitment. And so it's a very precarious time. And so I want to share with you today what I learned about generosity from you, from family, from my blood family, from my church family, from my Black church family. That's why I entitled the presentation, What the Black Church is Taught Me About Generosity and What It Means for Faith and Philanthropy Today. But I want to properly set expectations, so I don't stand before you today with answers to all the questions that you have. Rather, in alignment with Dr. Lamar's call yesterday to return to our ancestral understandings of generosity, I have memories and reflections on the many gifts and giving traditions of the Black Church. Instead of answers, in the spirit of Dr. Hagen's focus yesterday on giving and charity, I will offer questions that I hope you'll find provoking. I'm a historian, which means that I'm a storyteller. Stories are how I interpret data from the past and translate them into knowledge for today and tomorrow. Further, I'm a PK, which means I grew up among some great storytellers. My grandfather, father, uncle, and cousin are all pastors. And I was shaped by powerful stories from the pulpit to the dinner table. So today I'm going to leave the sermons to you, the experts. But I do want to share with you some stories and lessons that nurtured and socialized me into the faith of our forefathers and into the grand tradition of Black church generosity. Some will be familiar to you and spark your own memories. But I want to see if there's something about what we already know that can speak to us now. And I think there is. Because what I first learned about philanthropy didn't come from Excel spreadsheets. What I first learned about philanthropy didn't come from regressions and cross-tabulations. It didn't come from college classrooms, of academic journals, approved theories of the academy, or even the PhD at the end of my life. In fact, when I began working on that degree, I was very frustrated by these sources of knowledge in the field. Something was off about it. As I read and digested them, I couldn't see us. I couldn't see myself. I couldn't see all that I had known and experienced. Therefore, I knew the conclusions it was drawing about this thing called philanthropy were specious, insufficient, incomplete. You see, when it came to Black folks, the canonized literature on philanthropy, especially in history, takes two approaches: ignore them or denigrate them. In these history books, you either can't find us or we're typecasted as problems to be solved in American history, rather than as human beings with agency, integrity, doing the best we can with the little we have to navigate the violent realities and harsh absurdities in American history. These history books are filled with stories of the great white philanthropists, the saviors of humanity, the saviors of Black folk. There was little recognition of how we got over it. There was little recognition of how we used generosity to make a way out of nowhere. There was little recognition of how our philanthropy made America better and more of who she's supposed to be. This troubled my spirit as I sat in class or studied late at night because it didn't fit what I knew for sure. What I first learned about philanthropy came from the everyday givers in the churches of my time. Not millionaires by any stretch of imagination, and they wouldn't dare refer to themselves as philanthropists. They were more likely to say they were simply doing the Lord's will, doing what you're supposed to do, or my favorite, trying to make it in that. But philanthropy, nah, that's somebody else. The givers I knew were the elderly Black women who would press $5 into your palm on Sunday morning just because.
Right.
They send you a birthday card with a Xerox of a scripture and a meditation from Our Daily Bread, along with a handwritten message that said, I pray for you every day. The givers I knew were the men who showed up at my little league game because they knew showing up for children of the church was important. The givers I knew had been through some things, and so they felt deep down in their core that giving was the least they could do for a God so wonderful and forgiving. With the cadence of soldiers marching into battle, the givers I knew would stomp their feet while sitting and Coleraine, North Carolina. Before the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and the Center on Philanthropy, I was enrolled in this School of Generosity, and its lessons were legion. Yet the authoritative sources in the field were saying to me that what I had learned and experienced firsthand didn't exist. It wasn't real. The definitive sources and similar writers in the field were gaslighting me. So I decided to do the work. I decided to go back in time, back in history, back through the archive to find the key. And so my plan today is as follows. Before entering into reflection and remembrance about some of the gifts and giving traditions of the Black church, I want to consider for a moment why this remembering is important to begin with. Then I plan to share with you a few stories of generosity that the Black church taught me before closing out. So let's get into it. Remembering and reflecting. Why should we take the time, as David has asked, to remember and reflect upon gifts? Why is it important to remember the practices and traditions that formed us as givers? Well, I think doing so can not only help us remember what's important, as in bringing back to mind, memory, or recollection, but it actually can help us remember or reconstitute or reconstruct our sense of who we are. Giving, rightly defined and properly understood, tells us something about who we are as givers. You see, in today's world of philanthropy, we come to think of gift giving as purely monetary and transactional. Send us $24, we'll send you this mug. You pledge $50 per month, and you get to be in the Big Givers Club. Give to our football team, and Coach Primetime will come shake your hand. But it's so much more than that. It's more than money. It's more than the transaction. When our grandmothers and grandfathers took the first fruits of their labor and laid them at the altar of God, they were trying not to be conformed to this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of their minds. They were actively resisting depression and threats of this world, seen and unseen, that daily assaulted their intelligence, their dignity, and their humanity. They were saying something about who they were then and who we are today. When we reflect upon our giving, we recover a part of us. And given the current precarity of the Black church, we would do well to remember in this moment. But we also need to remember because we can forget. We can take our own giving for granted because it's so ubiquitous. Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean sometimes it's hard to come by. As religious leaders in the community, you know better than anyone else how it must be encouraged and continually taught, and sometimes private. But it's so much a part of daily life that it can seem natural, unknowable. Philanthropy has not always been our preferred word. We're more likely to say we're doing the Lord's will, giving back, hooking a brother up, all these kinds of things. But whatever we call it, it's important for us to recognize and remember and reflect on our giving because it can be invisible to us. When we reflect upon our giving, we can recover a part of ourselves. This is why I wrote the book, Matthew C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, Black Women's Philanthropy during Jim Crow, because I didn't want it to be for academics. I wrote it for the everyday givers in the community that produced it. Giving was a huge part of the transformation that turned Sarah Breedlove, the poor, orphan, widowed, single mother, struggling under the emerging Jim Crow regime in the 1890s, into Madam C.J. Walker, the early 20th century millionaire Black woman entrepreneur and philanthropist who loved the Lord, changed history, and fought for her people. To the delight of many of you in this room, Madam Walker was what you call a good AME. To her subscription to the Christian Report. Amen. She was a member of Bethel AME Church, whose historic sanctuary we now sit, and it was built by the very generosity that I'm speaking of. Madam Walker, studying Madam Walker was in fact studying ourselves. When we reflect upon our giving, we recover a part of ourselves. For over 26 years, I've been working in the field as a fundraiser, researcher, and teacher. And in that time, I concluded that the history of African American philanthropy, in part, has been the search for hospitality in a land of hostility. Wow. The U.S. has been a land of both obstacles and opportunities for African Americans, where far more of the former have been provided over the latter. However, whether dealing with obstacles or opportunities, African Americans gave their way through this history. And the Black church was the central mobilizing institution for that giving. And even though contemporary scholars I was made to study while working on my degree didn't get that, Black scholars of the past have long understood this. In 1909, Du Bois wrote this in the National Study on Black Philanthropy. Few races are more instinctively philanthropic than the needy. It is shown in everyday life and in their group history. Some few of their philanthropies in America in early days have been recorded. Let us remember the context for his study. 1909 was 4 decades removed from slavery, 3 decades removed from the end of Reconstruction, 1 decade removed from the 1896 Blessing versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision that codified Jim Crow, the law of the land. And in this context, Du Bois wrote, few races are more instinctively philanthropic. When we reflect upon our giving, we recover our partners. In his report, he paints a robust philanthropic landscape with Black-led, Black-funded, Black-funded organizations going back several decades into the 1800s. He provides a list of Black philanthropists going back to the 1700s. From churches, fraternal orders, literary societies, to women's clubs, orphanages, old folks' homes, and schools, Du Bois documents thousands of Black organizations and Black people desperately trying to lift up their race in the face of unrelenting hostility, terror, hatred, all sanctioned by U.S. public policy. Du Bois showed the Black agency through giving across American history. And remember, Du Bois was no casual observer. He was a scientist, a sociologist, a historian, the first Black PhD to graduate from Harvard. The brother was bad. But as bad as he was still behind the curve because the sisters had already worked it out. We were already on top of it, as is often the case according to my wife. In 1894, this Black woman, Gertrude Moselle, a journalist and activist from Philadelphia, wrote this statement in an essay titled The Work of the Afro-American Woman. Perhaps the effort that is most unique and yet entirely consistent with the character of the Black race has been done along the line of philanthropic work. She makes claims for Black people as philanthropists in 1894. 15 years before Du Bois, Moselle worked it out. When we reflect upon our giving, we recover. In her essay, she paints a robust picture and landscape dominated by generous Black women, from the working class to the wealthy. She specifically named as philanthropists Black women who were teachers, factory workers, journalists, artists, orators, club women, church women. It didn't matter how they made their livelihood, they were all philanthropists according to Moselle. And the Black church taught, grew, and channeled this generosity towards bringing about the kingdom and towards the struggle for freedom. And so Du Bois and Moselle help us understand important dimensions of the pervasiveness of Black generosity and robustness of Black philanthropic engagement over 100 years ago. But we also know that that generosity predates that time period and goes back to the very founding of the Black church, particularly the AME Church and the other independent Black churches. Long before our enslaved ancestors sang "Steal Away," and then later that night disappeared into the Underground Railroad, they in fact did steal away to the edges of the cotton plantation to convene and worship in private away from the master's dangerous days. Amidst laws and statutes prohibiting our assembly and literacy, they would glorify God through song, dance, and scripture before heading back to face another day's toil and torture. As scholars of the word of history, you already know how the visible institution of the Black church emerged from the depths of slavery and rose to global prominence in its first 150 years, all the while fueled by Black generosity. A generosity that, according to Gertrude Moselle and Carter G. Woodson, Black men and women brought with them deep in their bosom as they laid in their own waste, shackle to shackle, in the bottom of transatlantic slave ships. When we reflect upon our giving, we recover upon ourselves. Money is important. We all need money. The church needs money. In our struggle for freedom, we certainly needed money, but we needed so much more. And Black generosity strives to meet those needs. That's why I write in the book about so many different types of giving in this tradition. This was a consequence of our condition, and it evolved because that's what we needed. What do you do when all three sectors of society, government, business, nonprofit, are complicit in your oppression? Yes, what do you do when all three sectors turn their backs on you and actively, intentionally make your life a living hell? When it came to our freedom, we looked upward on high and we looked inward towards each other. Black generosity built our own churches, schools, agencies, hospitals, and other networks to survive because government, private business, and nonprofit sectors were often fair weather friends. Not there when we truly needed them. And most of the time they had to be coaxed, convinced, and forced to be there when they finally showed up. That's why Madam Walker was one of many African Americans who rose to the occasion to address these needs. Over time, as she acquired more resources, she simply gave more. She didn't wait. She couldn't afford to wait. The need was too great. The devastation was too real. Jim Crow was on her back every single day. So she did what she could with what she had. This is why I use Walker in the book as both a metaphor and a physical embodiment of this grand tradition of Black church-inspired generosity, to help us recall and remember who we are. And now is a good time to remember who we are, The familiar refrain of the three sectors turning their backs on us is happening again. White supremacy is turning up the heat again, with renewed cover from leading public sector politicians who are normalizing it and recodifying it into law, just like their Jim Crow such things.
We pause in the spirit of Mahalia and Aretha to look back and wonder how we got over this history that's now being banned, how we got over the ebbs and flows of outrageous fortune that is our American experience. One of the many things we'll see is that everyday Black generosity fueled the many works that activated the faith our God used to bless our freedom struggle and deliver us. We couldn't get over because of the many benefits we enjoyed during slavery. We got over because we believed, right? Huh? You missed that? We got over because we believed, because we fought, because we never gave up, because we gave generously and sacrificially in many ways. When we reflect upon our giving, we recover a part of ourselves. So let's revisit some of these gifts and traditions of the Black church that animated my childhood and likely yours. The philanthropist known as Madam C.J. Walker, who attended this church, was not driven to give by wealth, but started out as young Sarah, who was taught to give by the women of the AME church. And here's one of them, Jessie Batts Robinson. She was a leader in the St. Paul's African Methodist Episcopal Church in St. Louis, Missouri. When Sarah was 22, she migrated to that city with her young daughter in tow. She was fleeing rising racial terror. And so as this poor, orphan, widowed young mother, Sarah needed help. And it was St. Paul's that came to the rescue. In the spirit of Dr. Bradford and Dr. Rivers' discussion of social impact and community development yesterday, Jessie and the women of St. Paul's helped the church establish what I call a robust philanthropic social safety net of organizations and services to meet the needs of Black people. Because of Jessie and other women in the church, St. Paul stood at the hub of social services that included a Black orphanage, a Black old folks home, opportunities for schooling, and advocacy for civil rights against Jim Crow, all fueled and financed by the love, time, and pocketbooks of Black people. Jessie presided over the church Mite's Missionary Society, which performed home missions work. She was a member of the National Association of Colored Women, which built schools, programs, and other services around the country. And she became the president of the Court of Calanthe, a Christian fraternal order dedicated to charitable works. She and Sarah became the best of friends. They sang in the choir together. Sarah joined the Court of Calanthe, the Mite Missionary Society, and later the NACW through Jessie. Jessie would eventually work for Madam Walker's company, and Madam Walker learned to give by following the example provided by Jessie and the other AME church women. 2 decades later, Madam Walker was interviewed by a newspaper and said this: "It was in St. Louis that I learned that it was truly my mission to relieve the poor and distressed as I was able." So when you see a picture of Madam Walker and you think about her philanthropy, you're not looking at the noblesse oblige of a wealth-infused capitalist. You are, in fact, looking at the God-inspired, AME church-infused brand of Black women's generosity. Black church women taught Sarah to give, which reminded me that I, too, had learned from similar examples and teachers. My first memory involves the Black church's gift of edification and calls to mind the following story. I was around the age of 9 and standing in the procession of kids heading on stage in the lower annex of my father's church at Union Baptist in Orange, New Jersey. It was a spring Sunday morning. Sunlight shone through the box windows in the annex. The audience of church members were assembled in neat rows of rusty brown folding chairs with the church's name stenciled in black on the back. Between 2 morning services, they gathered for the children's Sunday school play. The shiny oak steps ascending the stage left echoed with the footsteps of my 4th and 5th grade peers ahead of me as they hustled to the top and glided towards the center. But I yelled out, "No," to my Sunday school teacher as I blocked the steps and refused to go on stage. I don't recall the play itself. Honestly, by this point, I had been in so many plays, it's hard to recall. If you grew up in the Black church in the 70s and 80s, there are two things for certain: Martin Luther King Jr. fans and Sunday school plays. There was no escaping either. The former kept you cool inside 100-year-old church edifices with no AC during sweltering summers. And the latter was a staple program that was a great source of misery for kids like me. The Christmas play, the Easter play, the Black History Month play, the Mother's Day play, the Father's Day play, the Children's Day play, the We Need to Have Another play. And mind you, these were not your typical high school play productions, right? With elaborate sets and colorful costumes. More often than not, the stage was the set itself, if your church had a stage, and the costumes were whatever you wore to church that day. The scripts usually consisted of Bible verses, poems, historical speeches to memorize. Occasionally, we reenacted a scene from the Bible or played a famous Black person. That day, the audience of adults sat beaming with pride at the babies, while our siblings sat next to them, rolling their eyes, yearning to go outside and ride bikes. My no was firmly uttered in response to a question posed to me by my Sunday school teacher, Miss Barbara Brody, or Mom Brody, as we called her. About 4'5" with dark, beautiful chocolate skin and thick Coke bottle glasses, Mom Brody was an active church lady at Union, just like Jessie Batch Robinson. I had been cutting up in the hallway as we lined up for the play. I wasn't feeling it and didn't want to participate. And as the preacher's kid, I was a spoiled brat for sure, but few kids like these plays. But Mom Brody was fed up with my attitude. As an experienced educator, she had full control of the situation, though I thought my mini rebellion had a chance. In front of the audience, Mom Brody looked at me with that evil mom's eye that Black children are familiar with, and she grunted at me in a tone that was not quite a whisper, but was not audible to the audience. "You don't want to go on that stage?" she whispered, while maintaining the appearance of a smile. I thought it was a question, but soon realized it wasn't. "You don't want to do the play, huh?" she quibbled. "No," I uttered foolishly. By now, the tension was real and palpable. The audience knew something was up. With her back towards the audience, Mom Brody leaned in towards me, her face contorted, with her lips spread tightly across clenched teeth. She grabbed me by the arm and forcefully motioned me up the steps while uttering in aggravation, "Get your behind up on them steps, bro." Scared to death, I hustled up the steps and assumed my position on stage. Mom Brody turned to face the audience with her beautiful smile, angelic voice, and began the play. But Black church play trauma aside, something more powerful was at work that day. I did not realize it at the time, but later would be thankful. The plays, the skits, along with Sunday school and vacation Bible school and the other activities we as Black kids growing up in the Black church had to endure, were actually part of a long-standing, time-tested curriculum of leadership development, service, and edification that Black churches developed to help prepare their children for life in a cruel world that would never love them or nurture their true potential on its own accord. It was part of what the great Harvard University scholar Dr. Imani Perry calls the formal culture of Black organizations. It was their fail-safe for an unresponsive public school system that erased our history from the curriculum and tracked our kids into lower performing classes. It was our safe space away from the white gaze, where we could be ourselves, express ourselves, and aspire to greater things. As they filled us with the gifts of God's word, they equally filled us with history, knowledge, positivity, love. They taught us public speaking, to present ourselves in a certain way, to stand tall in confidence in Christ and in the history of our heritage, always prepared to do our best. They were edifying us and building us up and getting us ready for a world unforgiving towards Black people. I hated it then, but oh, how I'm grateful now. The Black church's gift of edification through its educational leadership programming was transformational for me. I use it every time I stand behind a podium like this one, when I interact with my students in class, when I consult with organizations in the community. It's the reason why I view education as philanthropy to this day and part of my God-given calling. The gift of edification is part of the traditions and practices that shaped me as a giver. The second story I want to share involves the gift of words. About 5 years after the play debacle, I remember walking down the main aisle of church following the 11 a.m. service. It was a hot day as sweltering heat radiated through the sanctuary, overcoming the futile efforts of those MLK fans again. My father had just finished the benediction, and saints were milling about, hugging each other, chatting and catching up. The church sanctuary was resonant with laughter, smiles, and fellowship. As I strutted down the aisle, I saw coming towards me Mr. Burns. Mr. Burns was an elder in the church. His family had been members long before my father was called to the pastorate. He and his lovely wife and adult daughter were staples in the church every Sunday. They always sat on the inner aisle in the 8th pew from the front row. I remember Mr. Burns was wearing a 2-piece tan suit with a dark brown tie and newly polished leather shoes. Beneath his arm was a matching derby hat with a dark feather tucked in the band. As the distance between us shrank, I could see the brightness in Mr. Burns' eyes and an enormous smile beginning to form. Now, my self-absorbed teenage self was planning to just wave and keep it moving as we passed each other. But Mr. Burns had other plans. He stopped me in my tracks, put his hands on my shoulders, looked me dead in my eye and said, "Tyrone, you could be president of the United States one day if you want to." Now, I had heard my parents talk about the occupant of the White House at that time. And based on what they said, I had no desire to be any of the names they called Ronald Reagan. So I thought Mr. Burns was crazy. But as Mr. Burns stood there, I could see the conviction in his eyes. I could see the truth beating in his heart. He was genuine. He meant what he was saying. And he needed me to believe it too. Mr. Burns smiled at me, hugged me, and then left. Years later, on that historic fall Tuesday night in 2008, I sat with my family watching television as the Black First family of America ascended a stage in Grant Park, Chicago, ushering us into a new era. Mr. Burns and his wife had long since passed on to glory, but amidst the joy and celebration, a tear of gratitude formed in my eye for him. He would have loved to have seen the Obamas. Through their struggle and generosity, his generation fought for the possibility of the Obamas. And because of that, my generation got to see it. He was right. I could do anything. Scripture says death and life are in the power of the tongue. The church folk who nurtured me took it upon themselves to sow seeds of love and hope into my young heart, mind, and spirit. They gave me a decolonized and scripturally grounded narrative about who I am and who we really are to replay and fend off against the daggers of what Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu once called the conspiracy to destroy Black boys and girls. The precious gift of words is part of the practices and traditions that shape me as a giver. The last gift I want to share is the Black church's gift of hospitality. There are many ways that this hospitality played out. Take, for instance, the old school practice of pastor's aid. One Sunday afternoon per month, my church family gathered at the home of a member who hosted us in fellowship. Food was prepared, songs were sung, football was watched, as we shared in the generosity of hospitality, enjoying each other's presence and lifting each other up. Another example is ushering. At the surface level, it seems pretty basic. Open the doors for people, give them programs, take up the offering, right? That's it. I had served as an usher as a teenager and eventually became the vice president and president of the youth usher board in my home church. But it wasn't until my great uncle passed away in 2008 that I realized what was really going on. You see, he lived to be 95, and for 60 of those 95 years, he was an usher in his home church in Philadelphia. At his funeral, his pastor eulogized him with Psalms 84. "I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness." Along the way, he recounted how Pop Henry, as we called him, was always a steady presence of service in the church. He stood at the doors welcoming the people of God with a warm smile, a hearty hug, and a knowing nod. He not only distributed the programs and collected offerings, but also communion with white gloves on his hand, ensuring that all had the holy sacraments. He provided tissue to parishioners being visited by the Holy Spirit, and again, MLK fans for those visited by the summer heat. As a business owner, when there was a funeral at the church, he would temporarily close down his shoe repair shop, losing valuable time and money, report to church, and man the doors so that the grieving could be greeted and the family of the deceased could be tended to in their darkest hour. This gift of hospitality was a gift of service, a gift of presence, a gift of showing up and bearing witness to those in need. It was a gift of a familiar face and a warm smile for a hurting family. This particular act took on added meaning for me when I first heard my colleague and dear brother, Dr. Sharik Siddiqui, founder of the Muslim Philanthropy Institute, say that in Islam, smiling is a form of philanthropy. The gift of hospitality is a staple of Black church generosity practices and traditions that shaped me as a giver. And there are many more practices that we could talk about, but time doesn't permit. These gifts that I've mentioned won't get you a tax deduction. They won't get your name on a building or on the donor recognition wall. They won't help you burn your church's mortgage, but they do comprise the very fiber of being, and possibly yours. They are part of how we got over. They are part of what has sustained us, and they are vital for our ongoing struggle. So to David King's directive, what are the traditions and practices that shaped you as a giver? What are your memories, stories, and lessons of generosity in the Black church? Are these practices still alive today in your churches and communities? How can they be reinvigorated, reimagined in the 21st century? Who is your Jesse Batch Robinson, Mom Brody, Mr. Burns, or Pop Henry? In this current precarity, we must ask ourselves, if not through the Black church, where and how will we learn to give? Where and how will we grow in the ministry of giving, caring, and sharing? Where and how will we develop community spaces and places that we fully own and control, where we can practice giving every day and advance the freedom agenda and the kingdom's agenda? As more and more universities are prohibited from teaching the truth of our history, will the Black church stand in the gap? What opportunities for Black faith communities are presented by the all-out assault on Black life and culture by an extreme political agenda that is literally erasing us, our books, our stories from classrooms, libraries, and history itself? How will we reimagine the gifts of the Black church generosity and continue to nurture them? How will we continue to develop giving as foundational, not only to our faith, but to our resistance? As I conclude, I want to leave you with this idea of faith and resistance as part of what we recover when we reflect upon our giving. They're both right there in the gifts of edification, words, and hospitality. They're both right there in the words of Du Bois, Moselle, and Walker. They're both right there in the actions of Mom Brody, Mr. Burns, and Pop Henry. Yes, giving is a form of worship. Yes, giving is required to maintain the church and its mission. Yes, giving is part of our identity in Christ. It's all these things, and it is our faith and resistance in action. If faith without works is dead, everyday Black generosity has fueled the many works that activated the faith our God used to bless our freedom struggle and deliver us. Generosity fuels the labor of the Black church. Generosity undergirds the many gifts of the Black church. And giving as faith and resistance fuels us as a people in the struggle. Madam Walker knew this, and the last story I'll close with illustrates. This picture was taken in 1952 at the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York, at the gravesite of Madam C.J. Walker. Hundreds of Black beauticians had come from across the country as far away as Oregon to honor her as a trailblazer in their profession. The picture captures a very powerful moment in the memorial service held that day. The man in the dark suit with his hands folded in the front is Walter White, the national president of the NAACP. According to the newspaper, in his comments, he said that the NAACP would not have survived the Great Depression were it not for the generosity of Madam C.J. Walker. Think about this for a moment. It's 1952, and he said the NAACP would not have survived the Great Depression from the 1930s without Madam Walker's gifts. A little background, Madam Walker gave money to the NAACP during her lifetime. She used her gift of voice to advocate for his national campaign against lynching. She also made charitable provisions for the NAACP in her estate plans, including the donation of proceeds from the sale of her 34-room mansion in New York. 33 years after her death, Walter White stood next to her grave and essentially said, "We wouldn't be here if Madam hadn't given." Now, that's a powerful and historically significant statement because in 1952, Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP's legal team was just beginning the early proceedings of what would become the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision that desegregated schools across the land. 2 years before that win, Walter White says, "We wouldn't be here if Madam hadn't given." 3 years before Rosa Parks stood up by sitting down in the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, Walter White says, "We wouldn't be here if Madam hadn't given." 3 years before the world had even heard of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Walter White says we wouldn't be here. In fact, in 1952, he wasn't even doctor yet. He was still a student at Boston University working on his doctorate. He hadn't even met Coretta yet, and here's Walter White saying we wouldn't be here if Madam hadn't given. Madam Walker fought Jim Crow segregation all of her life. She wanted Jim Crow to die. She wanted it to die during her lifetime, but it didn't. But she took the long view. 33 years after her death, because she and others gave, a victory came. and set in motion a slew of other victories as more soldiers like Walter White and Rosa Parks and Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King and countless others took up the baton, kept giving, and kept on going. Surely Madam Walker didn't know what her gift would do, but she had faith and hope. That same faith and hope are what we need today. Walker's giving was nurtured in the crucible of the Black church under the fires of American racism and sexism, and grew from the widow's mite to the millionaire's estate. It grew from her service in the AME Mite Missionary Society and singing in the choir to her confrontation of President Woodrow Wilson on the issue of lynching. At any given time, she did what she could with what she had, and as she acquired more, she gave more. That's giving as faith and resistance, like Mom Brody, Mr. Burns, Pop Henry. And when we reflect upon our giving, that's what we can recover about ourselves. As I have written, generosity is ultimately a form of hope. We give as an expression of the possibilities to which we aspire and that we want to make real. We give not only because the need is so overwhelmingly great, but in spite of its greatness. We are not deterred, though we might be daunted. Our gift represents the possibility of a different tomorrow. The hope wrapped up in each gift, no matter its size or constitution, is the hope of Daniel against Goliath. Over time, when our hope is merged with the hope of others through giving, mountains are moved and rivers are reversed. A gift by an African American during Jim Crow was an act of resistance and hope, an expression of dignity, and a signal that no matter the conditions, as long as one could give, the human soul would not be crushed. Yes, the times have changed. The church has changed. Society has changed, but white supremacy is the same. Racism and sexism playbook still the same. The gifts of Black church generosity are part of how we got over it. The gifts of Black church generosity are part of what sustained us. And the gifts of Black church generosity are needed now more than ever. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow. That is my initial response. Thank you for closing
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
in the Black Baptist Church tradition. Thank you. Let me invite all of us into now this Q&A part of this closing session for our community of practice. There's so many questions that I have, and I'm going to start with one. I'm going to start with one question. And Tyrone, I was as you were sharing with us, I was thinking about your current context and work within philanthropy, and was wondering, do we need a new definition of philanthropy, given the history of the gospel of philanthropy or the gospel of giving within the Black church context?
Yes. Yes. And that's part of the national conversation. There are a lot of people thinking differently about philanthropy. That's why I wrote the book, because again, I wasn't seeing what I was used to, right, in the literature or in the field's understanding of giving. And so I think we do have to broaden our understanding. We have a definition of philanthropy right now that's primarily based upon tax policy, right? And that tax policy is less than 100 years old. But philanthropy, generosity are ancient human practices that go back before that law, before the US, right? Go back to ancient times. And so how do we fully account for this kind of generosity, and what does it look like? The government has to put limitations because it's managing the public's money, right? So that's why you can deduct this, but not that. But if we think more broadly about generosity, we think about what we actually need to survive, to thrive, to bring down systems and to build up our communities. We can't be limited to what may or may not be able to be written off. So we do need to account for the non-monetary giving that I tried to capture here in the book and in the conversation. It's very important, and it's the foundation of our community.
Thank you. I want to open up to the audience to invite you into this conversation as we're thinking through why is it that we tend to see generosity then through more of a transactional or individualistic view, given the history of philanthropy within the Black community?
Yeah. So I think oftentimes, again, that's the most visible, right? You pass the plate, right? And I know a lot of people had to rethink that in this online age, right? How do you create rituals around that? But I think recognizing it, identifying it, connecting it to these traditions of giving is important, right? And we've seen this in research. It used to be a time where you would call people for surveys to understand their giving, and you'd ask them if they volunteered, and they'd say no. But then if you prompt them, especially for African Americans, you say, well, do you usher? Yeah. Right? Right? Do you, are you part of a Boy Scouts club, or whatever it might be? Right? They say, oh, okay. Right? This is not necessarily the language of the church, right? It's not necessarily the language of the community. So I think we have to, account for that and understand that it's many different types of gifts, and all of them are important in, again, the struggle for freedom and doing the work of the kingdom, and dealing with all the issues before us.
Let me invite the audience.
Education and creating an education program or series or systems that would allow us to embrace and then teach. Mm-hmm. So as you speak to different language, which is the other thing we talked about, different language, how do we move to a place of taking that language, taking that education, and building upon it so that we can help change the terminology of philanthropy and generosity?
So it's interesting. There's a movement afoot in our community to embrace the term philanthropy and bringing to it our notion of love, our notion, as the good doctor said yesterday, of caring about humanity, right? And so every August is Black Philanthropy Month, and there's a hashtag, right? BPM, whatever the year is, or BPM 365, right? And you will see people saying, I am a philanthropist, and they're posing and they're taking pictures, or they're with their giving circle, or they're with their sorority or their fraternity, right? And so there's this interesting play, because we've realized that we, whatever language we might use, we're not at the table, right? So this one movement says, well, we do have this tradition. It is ours. So this is what we mean when we say philanthropy, and we're going to be at the table. And we're going to elbow our way there if we have to. We're going to flip it per yesterday if we need to, right? But we need to be at that table because decisions are being made about our communities without us. So we've got to be conversant with whatever the sectors are doing. At the same time, I think we can continue to nurture that everyday giving. And there's kind of this idea too, whatever you call it, we need more of it, right? And need to empower people and give them more ways to express it. In the life of the church and in the broader community.
Thank you. I see a question over there. Dr. Freeman, I want to push a little bit around the conversation around the emergence of this Black giving circle.
Yeah.
And the impact, the history of philanthropy within the Black faith community that have given birth or rise to that. Mm-hmm. Given our new evolving definition of philanthropy.
Yeah. So when you see, so the past 2 to 3 decades, there's been an explosion of giving circles across America, right? And if you're not familiar with the concept, it's where a group of people come together, they decide on a certain amount of money they're all going to equally put into the pot, and then collectively they decide which kind of organizations in the community are going to get it. And even if you don't know the term, that will sound very familiar because that is what we have always done. Right. So now it's being called giving circles, but years ago it was called the Free African Society. Right. It was a benevolent society. Right. And there were free African societies all up and down the East Coast in the 1700s, 1800s. This is not new. This is a reinterpretation and a 21st century reimagination of that old technology of giving. And so I think it's important to remember that. And you see this when you go out to some of the giving circles. Many of them are connected to churches, or certainly the members are influenced by their upbringing in the churches, and others are thinking about other types of connections and networks. But what you're seeing now are manifestations, and the church has always been at the center of that. The church has typically fostered these types. We know And AME came out of the Free African Society, right? And it's very common for them to launch other lodges. I mentioned the old folks' home, the orphanage that they had in St. Louis, all anchored by the church in that congregation. So what you see in the Giving Circle is what we've always done. Yeah.
I see the question there. I want to invite the audience online. If you have a question, go ahead and type it in. And I think one of the staff members will be able to pull that out. So those that are joining us online, my sister.
Hello. As
Hello.
a current MA student of the Lilly School of Philanthropy, I am 100% inspired from what you said today, because I often sit in class. Currently, I'm taking History of Philanthropy, and I graduate next year. And I often ask myself, where are we in the narrative? And so my question to you is, within your research, are there other areas, because I have thought about getting a PhD. It's kind of hard for me to say that because I'm ready to be finished with the master's. Yeah, I'm ready to be finished. But I do think about what other areas are kind of looked over within the African, I guess I want to say in regards to African American and philanthropy. Does that make sense?
What other areas are?
Yeah, what other areas can be kind of explored
Within philanthropy
and African Americans? Because like I said, I don't really see us. And from from your book and your research, there's very limited amount of history of that's actually taught to us.
Okay.
I mean, Dr. King, you did a good job. I took it for religion and philanthropy.
I love that. So one of the things, so I do a lot of work with Black women's historians, Africana Studies scholars, and I'm privileged to be on the faculty of the Africana Studies department here. Brother Joseph is here. Dr. Joseph Tucker Evans is here. And one of the things that I had to do in order to do my work was connect with those fields and understand how they think about these questions. Because they're writing about philanthropy, but they don't use the word, right? They will talk to you about activism. And then you can go read all these new biographies about Fannie Lou Hamer, and you can see the very thing I was just talking about, right? They will write about resistance, right? Because again, this isn't just about kind of the interpersonal interaction of trying to help somebody eat. This is about also the freedom struggle, right? And we were trying to survive plantation life, or even in our free communities, we were trying to survive. And so when you look for our activism, when you look for our resistance, when you look for our caring and sharing, you will see our philanthropy. Right? There you go.
That was masterful, Dr. Freeman. Thank you very much. I'm deeply inspired. So normally when people dig deeply into the lives of someone like Madam C.J. Walker, you find other personalities that begin to speak to you, that may be asking for a book, that may be asking for an article, that may be opening a door for you. Could you share, if you will, those personalities that are on the cutting room floor of your intellectual inquiry that are begging for more?
Thank you. Yes. So Tommy LaFawn was a Black man in Louisiana in early 1800s, a financier involved in real estate and part of the Black Catholic tradition. And anyway, he left behind a lot of money. There are some things named for him today in the city of New Orleans, and the beginnings of Dillard University are attributed to money that and land that he first laid down. So there's somebody who needs some attention. Colonel John McKee was a Black man in Philadelphia who left behind money to start a school that would educate Black boys and white boys together. And his estate, I think it was 1902, left these monies, and the scholarship still exists to this day as sending Black kids to school. So there's things like that. And of course, being led and directed by our women, I've been wondering, well, what were the brothers doing? And how were they thinking about this? So the Free African societies, the fraternities, there's a lot of secret societies that need attention to. So those are a couple of names that have piqued my attention. Mhm, mhm, mhm.
Any other questions? I was intrigued by this suggestion around giving as faith and resistance. Shameless plug, the Lake Institute publishes a monthly newsletter, Insight. Please subscribe. I was asked to write an article, I think 2 or 3 months ago, and I ended the article by talking about that our own liberation is tied to our generosity. Can you talk a little bit about this generosity as faith and resistance?
Yeah. It's what I tried to capture there at the end, that when you make a gift, right, you're investing in a vision, you're giving to meet some sort of need, and you really don't know what's going to happen. You hope something's going to happen. And I saw that more and more as I was uncovering, getting into Madam's story and the women around her, because one of the other thing too is that, with all due respect to her legacy, she's unique in terms of her own accomplishments and becoming this millionaire, but she's very much reflective of what Black women do, right? And so I wanted to kind of capture, right, and give her the due respect, but also ground her in this tradition of giving and generosity. And I saw this hope in those gifts. I saw this resistance in those gifts, that whether they're building their own schools, they're trying to take control of the educational agenda. Where they are building their own orphanage or their social services, they're trying to take control of that situation because they're being denied everywhere else. And so I think it's important for us to think about that. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Kim Williams-Pulfer, and I have written some articles together, and she likes to call this our repertoires of resistance. That giving is part of our repertoire of resistance, right? That this is what we do. And so when you think about the marches in the civil rights movement, right, that's part of that generosity. That's part of that protest is part of that. But they also had to be transported there. They also had to be fed. They had to be bailed out of jail afterwards, right? There's so many resources that come to bear to make that happen. And that's what we did. So all of that is invested behind those marchers. All of that is invested in the NAACP, in the church, in the new networks and organizations that are evolving now and taking on this leg of that struggle. So I think making that connection is very important, and to see us in this tradition of giving as faith and resistance, I think can be inspiring us for what we're facing now with all the backlash and all the retrenchment back to Jim Crow sensibilities and approaches.
Thank you, Bishop.
So that phrase, that African American philanthropy is the search for hospitality in a land of hostility, honestly came to me when I was writing my qualifying exam for my PhD degree. And I was wrestling with a way to try to capture what I was seeing, what I was thinking. And I thought all about that what they're trying to do is they're trying to make America what it's supposed to be. They are faced with all these obstacles, and we are constantly accused of being victims. But there's no way you can look at that history and what they did and say that they were victims, or that we are falling into victimhood. Yes, they're victims of these systems. These things should not have happened. But they stood up to that. And they began resisting the moment they were put on the boat. You all know this. Some of them jumped off and preferred to drown or face sharks than go face the unknown over here, right? So that resistance has always been there. And so it was trying to figure out how to give voice to that. And this idea that we were using our giving to try to open this place up and to try to make something out of no way. We're used to saying it, trying to make the road a little bit smoother, trying to make the way a little bit more open or a little bit wider so more of us could come through. So that's what that giving is about. And the idea was, you may not have something, but if I have something, you have something. And those are the kinds of things that kind of brought us through this history. So that's what I was trying to capture. And then just thinking about the precarity, the things you've been talking about the past 2 days, what is the church's role in that? And how do we navigate changes in membership, changes in affiliation, changes in ways of thinking about their relationship to the divine. I don't know. Those are big questions we're all grappling with. But it strikes me as something peculiar that giving, which we don't often talk about or give voice to, was a very big part of this faith, a very big part of how we got over, and something we definitely need to reclaim and recapture now.
Thank you. We're going to take one last question all the way in the back, and that's you guys is my colleague, Tasha.
Yes.
Hi. Dr. Freeman, I'm curious about, in your research, if you discovered any role that accountability played. So sometimes when I think about generosity, I think when you give something to someone, you often may not be able to control what is done with the gift, sometimes in some forms of generosity. And I wonder if in your research, if you saw anything that made you wonder about how accountability and transparency and kind of the role of the receiver functioned with Madam C.J. Walker's generosity. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So the interesting thing, Madam Walker gave to Mary McLeod Bethune School, to Charlotte Hawkins Brown School. She gave to the Mite Missionary Society. She funded a lot of Black organizations. And when I was going through and doing a comparison, I found that many times her gifts would rival the size or scope of the gifts from the leading white philanthropists of the day. But again, she doesn't get attention. They do. Right, they do. But the other thing too, so she was in the NACW, National Association of Colored Women. So was Mary McLeod. So was Charlotte Hawkins Brown, right? They moved in similar circles. So she had a very different relationship with them. If you want to use the grantee-grantor relationship, they wouldn't. But the other thing that was interesting is when you look at her correspondence with them, and then you look at Carnegie's correspondence with Black schools or Rockefeller and the General Education Board, very, very different. The Black heads of organizations don't have to do the political song and dance with her that they have to do with them. We know Mary McLeod Bethune put industrial in the name of her school, the Daytona Normal and Industrial School, because she wanted to get some of that industrial money from Rockefeller and all those folks because they were pushing that industrial agenda, but that's not what she was doing. That's part of the politics of this funding, right? She didn't have to do that with Madam Walker. She asked, look, I need $200. Can you help me? So there was a different type of relation. There was a sense of trust. And today there's a big trust-based philanthropy movement that's been in the works for years, but got a lot of attention during the COVID pandemic, and where foundations are being called upon to trust more. But it does raise questions of accountability. We do know that the Black heads of organizations or organizations focused in our community have been locked out of many of those conversations, have been denied funding, or don't necessarily have the social capital and the cultural capital to navigate the philanthropic networks that unleash grants, right? That's been a big part of some of your conversations the past few days. So there have been some folks who have opened that up, but it also begs this question of, there's some people saying, just give people the money, give people who you've been denying or don't have access to, give them the money. And we're seeing some of that, but it does raise these questions of what then should the form of accountability look like, and how it can that be co-created in ways that aren't burdensome for the organizations, in producing reports this big for boards that aren't even going to read them, right? Versus doing the actual work in the community. So I saw a very relational, a very personal approach in there because she knew these women, and also because her own experience. I like to say too, that every gift she made was one she once needed herself, right? She gave to Black schools because Jim Crow denied her education. She gave to Black orphanages and old folks homes because she benefited from Black social services, right? And of course, we can't forget this, even though she becomes this millionaire, she's still Black, she's still female, she could be lynched, she could be raped. She still needed freedom, even though she had a 34-room mansion. So this idea that she can never escape, no matter how much she accumulates. Carnegie was poor as a child, but wealth forever delivered him from that. He never had to think about it again unless he wanted to. Madam Walker could never forget it because she was still vulnerable. That's what made her giving and makes our giving different.
Come on, will you help me to celebrate that? Tyrone, McKinley, Freeman.
Thank you.